Welcome to the Fun Time Program.
Welcome to the Fun Time Program. I'm your host, Vivica Volt, and this is my co-host.
With my sippy cup. I forgot to get a real cup. I was just getting chastised for the fact that I am always drinking out of this sippy cup here. And I had given you both of the only two cups that I have in my studio right now.
Well, I mean, I did need my water and also my cocktail.
Exactly. So I'm drinking out of a sippy cup today. Anyway, what are we doing today? This is our second episode.
Well, I mean, we should also tell them who you are.
Oh,
John
hi.
Fredrickson.
I'm John Andrew Fredrickson.
So, great host right here. So today we are going to be talking about cultural appropriation.
What is cultural appropriation? Vivica?
So the easiest way to explain it is the colonization of culture.
Colonization.
Yeah.
Let's go deeper into that. What do you mean exactly by colonization of culture? Because, I mean, obviously colonization means you have kind of an oppressive group coming into another group's territory and kind of taking over the power structure and imposing their will on that group.
Yeah. So what I mean by the colonization of culture is that it is the a group that has power systemically is coming in and cherry picking some of their favorite parts of a culture that is in some way a minority to their own culture, and then taking those cherry picked parts of that culture back and either profiting from it or wearing it as a costume or wearing it in a way that they get praise or adoration while the people that are still in that culture are being disenfranchised or in some way discriminated against for the exact same thing that they stole from that culture.
So what would be an example of that?
A perfect example, which is a very common example, is box braids, micro braids, dreads. Dreads is one of the hallmarks of cultural appropriation. War bonnets from indigenous cultures.
So is it usually things like hairstyles and clothing and stuff like that? Can it be food? For example, is eating a burrito cultural appropriation?
So that's a very common thing. Usually, when you're eating food and you have different types of cuisines, most of the time there is a cultural exchange and an acculturation that's happening. You're not just eating a food and disrespecting the people that food is coming from. You're appreciating at least a tiny bit of their culture, and they're sharing that culture with you respectfully. The biggest issue with cultural appropriation is there is a lack of respect behind it, and that is what's causing the disconnect and the offense.
Interesting. So it's like somebody's kind of taking on bits and pieces of your culture without taking the time to understand what they mean, without taking the time to build the bridges and build the relationships, and they're just kind of cherry picking stuff and using it in their own way, in a way that just doesn't show respect towards the original culture.
Correct.
And I think you're saying that usually there's a power dynamic involved in this?
Power dynamics. Yes, indeed. So most people seem to either misunderstand or not know about power dynamics and how they work. So what I mean by power dynamics is you have a reigning culture. In this case, you have white people who are the reigning race.
When you say in this case, you mean in this country specifically.
Right. So there is an oppression from white people towards minorities. And that doesn't necessarily mean that all white people are being oppressive towards every minority. That's not at all what I mean. I mean it on a systemic level across the board, from the way that our laws are written, from the way that our laws are enforced, to just even the rules that we have in both schools and in jobs, in workplaces. It is systemic across the board that there is levels of discrimination. You see it in housing, you see it in hiring practices, you see it everywhere. So there is a systemic level of oppression coming from white people. And those same white people will then turn around, and because they have the power in that situation, the oppressed party is lacking a power. And so as a Black person who has been systemically disenfranchised for a few hundred years, they are lacking a systemic level of power, which means when it comes to appropriation and race dynamics, it's kind of a one-way street. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So why, for example, is specific hairstyles? What is so damaging about somebody? Why can't somebody be using a hairstyle from another culture in a way that is paying homage to that culture, and maybe they find something about that culture inspiring, and they want to incorporate some of that into their identity, and they want to live part of that identity, and they think that they're being respectful towards the culture. What would you say to people like that?
So the thing is, if you want to truly be respectful to a culture that you're trying to pay homage to, as you say, you have to understand the power dynamics involved with taking parts of that culture that you appreciate and enjoy. So wearing a hairstyle that is traditionally seen as Black, such as micro braids or box braids, right? Or even cornrows. Those hairstyles are traditionally seen as Black, and Black women in America today, and Black men as well, are being discriminated against for jobs, for housing, and for education for wearing those styles. And in 48 different states, it's completely legal for an employer to fire a person based on their hair. But we will never see a white person get fired for a hairstyle that is traditionally Black, in the same way that we will see Black people get discriminated against for those exact styles. So for a white person to wear that style, it's a flaunting of privilege, and that flaunting of privilege inherently lacks the respect that they would need to do it in a way that is showing appreciation.
Now, what if the person who's doing it, though, just is completely oblivious to this? They have no understanding of the fact that they're flaunting their ability to wear these hairstyles in ways that people within the African American community are not necessarily able to wear those hairstyles in the same situations that the white person is able to get away with it, let's say.
Right.
They are an understanding of what the ramifications of, what the cultural impressions are that other people get when they see them wearing those hairstyles. Let's say somebody just thinks that they're being respectful. How do you treat a situation like that? Does that still make them a bad person? Does that still mean that they're doing cultural appropriation in a way that is offensive, even if they're just completely oblivious to the ways that what they're doing is coming across as offensive?
So that's actually a really great question. And the thing is, there's a misunderstanding, and it's an intentional misunderstanding that is built into our idea of how we look at race and racism. There is the idea that if you are racist, you are inherently a bad person. It is a moral judgment on your character. However, you can say and do racist things and still be a good person. It's not a moral judgment of your character. It's an indictment of the fact that you grew up in a racist society, and it is a reflection of the society that you grew up in. So even though I may look at someone and say, okay, they're doing something racist, that doesn't necessarily mean that I think that they are a terrible person. If it is pointed out to them that what they are doing is in fact racist, it is in fact harmful, and it is in fact disrespectful to a particular culture, and they choose to keep engaging in that act, that's when I'm going to say, okay, I'm no longer giving you the benefit of the doubt that you may in fact be a good person because you are choosing willfully now to engage in a racist act, and versus doing it completely ignorantly, not knowing the ramifications.
How do you differentiate between somebody who, obviously there are racists who really just want to do harm to people of certain other races and think of them as less than human, and think of them as not belonging within their culture. Almost, you could say, active racists who are making an active effort to put down another race intentionally, versus somebody who is doing something like this with the cultural appropriation, where they're maybe not necessarily fully aware of the way that their actions are affecting other people, and that they can be educated on it, and it's somebody who you might be willing to approach and actually engage them on this issue and hope to have a positive exchange on it, versus the other scenario where it's just like they're just a fucking asshole. You know
Right.
what I mean?
Okay. So I mean,
Linguistically, how do you differentiate?
so most of the time you have a situation where the people who are outright racist are going to let you know that they are outright racist.
Right.
Especially in reaction to someone like me, who happens to be of a darker complexion. So they're going to immediately react to me in a more negative way. They're going to be more hostile towards me. They're going to be less likely to listen to me. They're going to be less likely to want to engage with me. That being the case, I'm not going to waste my time, effort, or energy to try to educate them because they are choosing that willful ignorance.
But linguistically, how do you differentiate between that type of person and the type of person who's just doing cultural appropriation in an ignorant way?
I mean, linguistically,
Because I think one of the worries is that if we use the same word for both,
Right.
and you're saying that in the case where somebody's doing it out of ignorance and it's not intentionally harmful, that you don't necessarily see them as a bad person, you just see them as somebody who, you know, hopefully you can have a conversation with them to help them understand why their actions are making you feel a certain way. But if we use the same word to describe both of those people, and they're vastly different in terms of the harm that they can potentially cause, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
How do we differentiate them linguistically, you know?
I would say you have the overt and inadvertent racists.
Right.
So the inadvertent racists are the people who are doing things accidentally, who are saying things that are microaggressions, that are reacting to people in a way that is harmful, but they don't really realize that it's harmful, or they're reinforcing racist stereotypes without realizing that they're doing so. These are inadvertent racists. And most of the time, these are the same people who consider themselves good people and want to learn to do better, and they want to learn to be better. And those are the people that I'm always going to be willing to at least give some effort into educating.
Mm-hmm.
It's the overt racist that I'm just going to say, no, I'm not even going to waste my time, because it's not in my best interest and personal safety to try and educate someone who sees me as a hostile.
They're just a vile person. Now, is it fair to say that most likely, I would say it's unlikely for somebody who is an overt racist to want to culturally appropriate from a race that they are overtly racist towards? Or do you think that's not accurate?
That's not as accurate. So the biggest irony is that a lot of people who are overtly racist are also the same people to say, I am not racist. So Sean Spencer, who was, or was it Steven Spencer or Sean Spencer?
Who?
The guy who was running the Unite the White rallies.
Yeah, I should look it up. I'll look it up. Continue.
He was asked.
Wait, if I Google this right now, is this going to become part of my Google history?
I don't think so.
Unite the White. I'm interested in Unite the White right now. Should I? Am I going to end up on a list somewhere? Google.
I hope not.
Sean. I'll just get a Google Sean Spencer. We'll see what comes up.
So
he's a mixed martial artist. Maybe that's not the right one. Anyway, continue. Football player.
I'm terrible with names. I don't remember. But he basically was asked, do you consider yourself racist? Because he was running the Unite the White rallies.
Unite the Right.
Unite the Right.
Oh, I heard White. Richard Spencer and Jason Kessler.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I was right on the last name.
Okay, so he says he's not a racist.
He's the first person, if you ask him, he will say, I am not racist. But I think that white people are supreme.
I mean, you can't even engage that in conversation.
The cognitive
it's just absurd.
dissonance that's happening there is...
Well, it's just absurd.
Yeah. But that's the problem. You have a bunch of people who are fully convinced that they are not racist while they are saying and doing very racist things. You can't...
But I'd still put... I'd put him in an overt racist category.
Oh, no, he's absolutely in an overt racist category. I'm not in any way saying that he's not an overt racist.
But would somebody like him be culturally appropriating parts of a culture that he is being racist towards?
A lot of times people like him very secretly love things like hip hop music and rap music.
Really?
And oh yeah. and will
That's
have like
fascinating.
a black girlfriend that they keep on the side without telling anybody. Oh yeah. Overt racists love black culture much more than you expect them to.
Well, I'm just absolutely befuddled and confused by that. I haven't come across that, so I'm just going to take your word for that.
I've come across it far too many times.
Wow.
It's
Actually,
how
I think I have heard these stories. Never mind. I take that back. But we're not necessarily going to get into that today. So I guess where I was going with that was, if somebody is doing cultural appropriation, can we usually assume, ignoring the overt racist and those specific examples that you're talking about, most of the time it's out of ignorance?
Yeah, I'm going to say most of the time it's out of ignorance. And it's one of the reasons why if I see someone who's engaging in cultural appropriation, I'm very likely to kind of give them that like gentle nudge, like, hey, by the way, I don't know if you know this, but what you're doing is actually offensive.
And what's the feedback usually like when you talk to people like that?
Usually very defensive, unfortunately. There have been a couple times where I've had someone actually be receptive to hearing it, and it was unfortunately hard for them to hear because they considered themselves an ally. They considered themselves someone who was working towards the end goal of helping unite all of the different races and have kind of like the one big happy family. But they didn't realize that they were engaging in cultural appropriation on a level that negated their ability to be a proper ally.
What was their specific cultural appropriation, if you don't mind?
It was a white woman who had dreads for the last 5 years, and she saw it as part of her identity. And she said that it was the first time she had had long hair where she didn't hate looking at herself in the mirror, and she felt more feminine having long hair and hadn't found a way that she had been able to take care of her hair prior to letting it dread. And she was also the same person who would try to lecture people about Black Lives Matter and about different very liberal talking points and try to educate people about equality and social justice. And
so would you consider her an ally on those issues? Aside from the cultural appropriation thing, if that weren't a part of her identity, would you consider her an ally?
I would consider her someone who has the potential to be an ally. But it would be very difficult for me to consider her an ally because the message that her hair was sending.
No, I'm saying if her hair were not a part of,
right.
If her hair were not
if her hair was not a part of it, I would say that she would probably be at least a half decent ally, if not.
In what other ways would she have not?
Well,
been
I mean,
an ally?
I don't know her super well, so I don't know super in detail so I'm not going to say she was an amazing ally just except for this one thing. Because I don't know her super well, but at the same time, I was able to let her know, like, hey, as someone who has never really interacted with you face to face, because this was all on Facebook, because Facebook is a ridiculous, wonderful, and terrible place. I was able to basically say, hey, just so you know, as a Black person, if I saw you walking down the street, my immediate reaction to you would be, I can't fuck with that racist bitch. And I would not...
Simply because of her hair.
Simply because of her hair, because to me, just engaging with her adds so much more emotional labor to my engagement, because in order for me to have a conversation with her, to look past her hair, I have to at some point have a conversation with her about her hair. And that is putting the burden on me to educate her, and it's putting the burden on me to potentially put myself in a harmful place where she is defensive and may get aggressive, because again, I don't know her well enough to say, she's definitely not going to get aggressive with me, or make me out to be the aggressor in the situation, which I've worked very hard in my life to not come across as an angry Black woman in every situation. And so I try to avoid situations that will very easily make me look like one. and that would be one.
Do you feel that there's a societal pressure to avoid that?
Yeah, I feel like there has been kind of a pressure growing up to not be angry, because the moment that I show displeasure, it becomes, I am immediately quantified as an angry Black woman, even if I'm only vaguely displeased. And then as an angry Black woman, I'm immediately seen as aggressive and potentially a threat, even when I'm just somewhat upset. So I have had to monitor my emotions a lot more carefully, so that I don't come across as constantly aggressive.
Okay, because you're aware of the fact that people may have a stereotype in their head already before they even really get to know you, and you don't want to confirm that stereotype, so you kind of play to the other side of that. And okay, that's interesting. So in general, when you come across somebody like that who is wearing the dreads, and if you were to see her on the street, you would just assume that she's not an ally, assume that she's somebody you didn't really need to get to know, and assume that she was somebody you'd much rather just not get involved with and not have a conversation with. And then I think you were saying that on Facebook, though, that she was basically trying to say how she is an ally and that she doesn't understand why she can't be respectful towards the culture that she's appropriating.
Correct. And so I basically said that one of the reasons that she cannot be an ally while also wearing dreads is that while wearing dreads, you are basically flaunting your privilege in the face of all of the people of color, specifically Black people who have lost their jobs or lost out on their education, or lost out on opportunities because of that exact same hairstyle.
Or feel that they're not able to have that hairstyle because they would
Correct.
lose out on those opportunities. Okay.
Correct. So
she has a privilege where she's able to do it. And even if she doesn't have like a job as a lawyer or a job where maybe it wouldn't have worked out for her, the fact that she does have some way of earning a living or is able to live in life without having to think about the hairstyle of possibly affecting her is a privilege that people within the Black community don't have that privilege. And
Correct.
It's their hairstyle.
Correct.
So it's like, I can wear it, and she doesn't even realize how the culture that she's appropriating it from is not able to wear it in the same way that she is.
Correct.
Okay.
So that's where the disrespect comes in, where even though she is not actively trying to be disrespectful, and she is in fact actively trying to be respectful, she is inadvertently doing something that is racist enough that she has clearly lost out on friendships with Black people who saw her and wrote her off before even speaking to her.
So here's a lady who's trying to be an ally, trying to be respectful of the culture, and trying to learn more about it and basically be, involved in the culture. And here she is missing out on opportunities because the hairstyle that she's wearing, the way that she's wearing her hair, is turning people within that community off to her. And she's not even aware of this.
Right.
Wow. So how did she take that?
So it was one of the first times where someone took it to heart and actually listened. And I didn't follow up with her because, again, this was Facebook, and I'm not going to follow up with every single person that I ever interact with on Facebook. But she did take it to heart and realize that, wow, there are so many potential opportunities for close friendships that I've missed out on because of how I come across before I even open my mouth. And if my hair is doing this much harm, not only to my potential relationship opportunities, but also to my ability to be as strong of an ally as I want to be, I may have to reconsider my hair choices. And I gave her the perfect example of the fact that I, as a Black woman, have had my hair chemically treated and chemically straightened my entire life from the time that I was 7 up until January of this year. And January of this year, I transitioned over to natural hair. And in transitioning over to natural hair, I had to learn a whole new hair care routine. I had to buy a whole bunch of different products to take care of my hair. I had to buy different brushes to take care of my hair. I had to basically transition out everything that I knew about my hair prior to learn how to take care of it as it is now. And I mentioned to her that this if this is something that as a Black woman I can do, where it is me wearing my natural hair may still prevent me from getting job opportunities later down the line, I think that she can find ways to take care of her hair where she will still feel beautiful and have plenty of opportunities to learn how to take care of her hair in a way that's healthy for her hair, that's easy enough maintenance that she doesn't feel stuck. And she took it to heart and thanked me for very kindly pointing out that this was something that she hadn't really realized about how she was coming across.
She wasn't aware of the yeah. Wow. Okay. So that's really powerful then. If you're able to have those conversations in a way where somebody can understand that they thought they were being respectful, they thought that they were, taking on parts of another culture in a way that was respectful, and they just weren't aware of the ways that it was disrespectful and the ways that they were potentially missing out on relationships and opportunities to get to know people better because they were wearing this red flag on their head. Wow. Talk to me more a little bit about the power dynamics. So you say that power dynamics matter in the sense that, in the case of white culture in the United States, white women specifically, or I assume even maybe white men in some cases, taking on hairstyles from a culture that has traditionally been oppressed within the United States and doesn't still, like you said, is experiencing discrimination in the workplace in regards to hairstyles. They don't have the same freedom with their own natural hairstyles, their own cultural hairstyles, their own traditional hairstyles within the workplace that a white person might, being able to adopt some of these. So that's a power dynamic that makes it inappropriate. What if somebody, let's say somebody from a race that doesn't have that power dynamic, appropriates some of these hairstyles?
So
let's say Jeremy Lin, for example, he got called out for having dreads. This is a kid who,
correct,
Asian American, went to Harvard, played on the basketball team at Harvard, made the NBA, blew up for like a month on the Knicks, became sensation. It was called Linsanity. He was the most famous guy in the country for about a month, and he was absolutely crushing it on the Knicks and has managed to still have a successful NBA career since then, but is not a huge superstar otherwise. Very beloved within the Asian American community. And just an overall awesome dude. He started dreading his hair at some point and was called out, I believe, by Sean Marion.
Yeah.
On Twitter. And Sean Marion basically said that, you're... Should I pull up the actual tweet? Because it was actually interesting. What are your thoughts on that? So there isn't a power... There isn't the same power... I don't know if there is a power dynamic, but there isn't the same power dynamic between the Asian American community and the Black community in the same way that there is between the white community and the African American community in this country.
Oh, absolutely.
So I actually have the tweet here. It is actually Kenyon Martin. I don't know why I said it was Sean Marion, but Kenyon Martin, he was quoted as saying, "Do I need to remind the boy his last name is Lin?" Martin said with a sarcastic face and tone. Like, come on, man, let's stop it with these people. There's no way possible he would have made it on one of our teams with that bullshit on his head. Come on, man, somebody needs to tell him. Like, all right, bro, we get it. You want to be black? Like, we get it. But your last name is Lin. So this is interesting because we talked about, how there isn't necessarily a power dynamic here, but at the same time, what Jeremy Lin is doing is obviously coming across as offensive to people within his own community. I mean, he's part of the basketball community, right? So within his own community, people that he should generally consider his coworkers, his colleagues, his, you almost want to say like brothers in the sense that they're very, it's a community. He's doing something that he obviously thought when he did it was being respectful or wasn't at least being disrespectful. You would assume. I can't imagine he did it with the intention of pissing people off, but obviously it came off to some people in a way where they're like, no, I don't find that respectful. So I guess what I'm asking is, does there need to be a power dynamic for something to be cultural appropriation?
So yes and no. So the power dynamic from the oppressed party to the marginalized party is where you get the cultural appropriation. However, from an oppressed party to an oppressed party, it's not officially appropriation. It's what's considered a culture vulture. So it's...
Who defines these terms? Like, who decides it's officially this or it's officially that? Like, is it just people's opinions and people discuss these things and it's kind of decided within the community? Like, if I Googled this right now, could I Google the difference between cultural appropriation and Culture vulture. Culture vulture sounds worse. I'm not gonna lie. Like I feel like I'd be more offended if somebody called me a culture vulture.
Well, I feel like I would be a little bit more offended if someone called me a culture vulture too, because the thing about being a culture vulture is you are coming from a disenfranchised group, so you understand what it's like to have your culture be appropriated. You understand what it's like to have your culture be discriminated against. You have that understanding of having seemingly sacred things from your culture being exploited and taken away from you. And to do it to another culture for funsies is arguably more offensive because you know how much that hurts.
So it's almost like you expect a certain, it's almost like you expect more understanding from another culture that's been through a similar experience. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so so there doesn't necessarily have to be a power dynamic. It can still be offensive.
It can still be offensive, even if there isn't the same power dynamic of the oppressor to the oppressed.
Right.
So it is a perfect example was a few years back, Nicki Minaj released a video where she was dressed up in all Asian garb and was kind of play acting as a geisha. Ooh, that was offensive. Like I could not watch all the way through that video because I was like, Nicki should have known better.
So can you be offended even if you're not a part of the culture that's being appropriated?
Absolutely, because I'm offended for the fact that she chose to not only wear another culture as a costume, but also she's making other Black people look bad by association because she's choosing to engage in this behavior where it's already so easy for people, especially from the white dynamic, to look at Black people and say, oh, see, they're doing yet another thing that like they say we can't do, but they're doing it. And if they can do it, why can't we?
Yeah, I can see that. So you're upset from that perspective where it's like she's making it more difficult for you to call out other people for cultural appropriation when she's appropriating other cultures and basically watering down or muddying the waters and making it unclear if maybe,
Right. And so it's hard not to be offended by that because I always want to uplift Black people. I want it to be a lot harder to be reproached, right? So I want to be above reproach at all times. And in that kind of a situation, it's almost difficult because she should have known better. And I mean, as an artist, there are plenty of like limbs that artists step out onto in trying to be edgy or cool or whatever. But every part of that was just not it. And Little Kim did that back in the 90s and caught a lot of flack for it. So
is there a way to incorporate parts of other cultures? Because art in general loves to draw influence from other cultures. Yves Saint Laurent was famous for living in Marrakesh in Morocco and drawing inspiration from the color and the beauty and the different styles in that city. He also took a lot of flack for it because he was somewhat of an oppressor living, amongst the aristocracy in a gated community while there was just rampant poverty. I mean, it's still like that. I went to Marrakesh a couple of years ago, and it was extremely uncomfortable seeing the dichotomy of the wealth next to the just abject poverty. But other examples. Is it possible to draw inspiration from other cultures, to incorporate it into your art, into your creative expression? Maybe not necessarily into your identity, and that's where I can see the problem with the hairstyles, with clothing, with jewelry can be challenging. Like, for example, if I were to walk down the street wearing that necklace, I think that could potentially be offensive to people, or definitely would be offensive to people. A
little bit more on the definite side, but yeah.
But as an artist, I don't have any of that inspiration to try to adopt these things as my identity in the way that somebody wearing dreads might. But I still want to be able to draw inspiration from other cultures in my art and in my artistic expression in a way that's respectful to those cultures. What would you say to artists who want to be able to do this, want to be able to draw inspiration, want to be able to do it in a respectful way? How do you go about doing it in a respectful way?
So the best thing to do is to talk to someone who is actually from that culture, preferably pay someone from that culture, if you have the means of doing so, to educate you on what is and isn't appropriate from their culture to borrow. So there are plenty of things from, say, like African American culture, where like if you're gonna come have food with us, like I'm absolutely gonna feed you. I'm absolutely gonna show you like what our ribs are like. I'm gonna show you like how our cornbread is just banging, right? So there are plenty of things that like I am happy to share, but
Is cornbread a?
I mean it's a Southern thing.
Because I grew up with a Southern mother, and we love
Oh yeah, but
cornbread
like,
growing up, and
oh,
so
right.
my only connection to that is
right, but like, have you had a black woman's cornbread?
I have not.
Okay, all right. So that's what I'm saying. Like,
But what I'm asking is that something that comes from the black community specifically, or is it just a Southern thing in general?
that I think that's just a Southern thing in
Okay.
general. But
Okay.
I'm just saying like, black people do it better.
All right, we'll have to have a cook-off, Mom. You ready? You ready to have a little cornbread cook-off? Do you eat it with molasses? Because we always had it with molasses.
You know, actually, I prefer it with honey, but like I would try it with your molasses.
Okay, all right.
Like,
Mom, get ready. So how can you do it? It's about talking.
yeah, so
It's about engaging.
Right, it's about engaging the culture. So like another great example is engaging with a Native American tribe, or Indigenous American tribe that's in your local area.
Why do you say sorry?
Because the proper term is Indigenous American, not Native
Since
American.
when? I've never heard that.
Oh, well,
You're educating me now.
I love it. I love educating you. It's my favorite thing. So I heard it about 3 years ago.
People still use Native American, don't they?
People do still use Native American, but Indigenous Americans have asked that we call them Indigenous, not Native. And I want to be respectful to
Okay.
the
Good to know.
people who have asked.
That seems easy enough.
Yeah. I feel like it's the easiest change in language. So
Yeah. Anyway, you were
right. So if you were to approach an indigenous tribe, and a lot of times they are going to have things on sale, and a lot of times the things that they have on sale are available to the public, knowing for a fact that they are sharing the parts of their culture with you. But that doesn't mean every part of their culture is available for share. So you have people who are wearing war bonnets. That was never something that was available to share from an indigenous tribe. That was not something that they put up as a, hey, y'all can have this, like wear it to parties and like have a great time in costumes. It was something that was stolen from their culture, and a mockery was made of it. And that mockery became almost a costume icon.
so like the headdress, for example,
Right.
which is called
A war bonnet.
A war bonnet.
Mhm.
Bonnet seems like a cute little thing that a little
Unless
white
you-
girl would wear.
Yeah, maybe you should look up a picture. They are
I know what a
not
war bonnet
that
looks
cute.
like. I've
They
just
are
never heard it
not-
called that.
They're dope, but they
Yeah.
are not cutesy.
No, they're fierce.
They are very fierce. So war bonnets were not something that Indigenous Americans ever intended to share. It was something that was used as a mockery of them, especially in the cowboys and Indians kind of trope, especially in that like Wild West kind of way, where you have all these kids running around in like fake feather war bonnets.
Yeah.
And turning around and being like, I'm an Indian, woo, 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 woo. Super offensive.
I mean,
and
the whole history of
still very offensive.
of relations between what were called the Indians at the
Mm-hmm.
time and the white settlers, especially in popular media up through the 30s and 40s, the whole John Wayne
Mhm.
era. And I mean, it's just phenomenal looking back on these things, how insensitive it was.
Yeah.
And how oblivious people were to how insensitive it was, because there wasn't enough actual communication going on between the cultures.
Correct.
It was literally just the settlers, the white culture, that was pulling parts of those cultures that they were oppressing and using them in a way that was entertaining and comical, and what they thought was just, having fun with it, without recognizing that it was extremely offensive to us. And the same thing was done with the African American community as well. With
Correct.
the
Well, I mean, what you're
actors.
describing, that like cherry picking different
Right.
parts of a culture and using it for their own entertainment and or
So that's interesting though, because that to me is an obvious example.
Right.
Like when we look back on the way it was back then, that's obvious. I think the problem that we have today is to be able to look on our current actions with the same clarity that we're able to look on actions from 40, 50 years ago, or even like, let's say 20, 30 years ago, and seeing them from somehow we've evolved. We've evolved in our communication and our understanding of one another
Right.
to the point that we can look at the cowboy and Indian movies and be like, yeah, that's unfortunate.
We
You know,
should've
the
never
way
done
that
that,
we
yeah.
were portraying those, and that we wouldn't do today. But then how do we look at our current actions today within media, within art, within just individual people adopting different parts of different cultures? You know, how do we get that perspective to continue to evolve our understandings of these things? I mean, I guess it's communication.
It's absolutely communication.
Yeah.
So if you're talking to someone who is from the culture that you are being inspired by, they can absolutely tell you what is and isn't sacred in their culture. So
Right.
perfect example, going back to the hair situation. So as a Black woman, especially as an African American in this country, when we were brought here on slave ships, we were stripped of every part of our original African culture. We were not allowed to keep anything that we originally had. And while we were on the plantations, one of the only things that we were actually able to pass down from generation to generation was how we maintained our hair, because it was something that we had to know. It was something that we had to be able to do to have hair that was even generally tolerable.
Do you know if there was an oppression of like what hairstyles were allowed by different slave masters?
I mean,
Was there much of a movement to oppress that?
I think that was, it probably varied from plantation to plantation, but it also, I think if I'm not mistaken, and this is not something that I'm like super well versed in, but I'm almost positive that there was a movement to have slaves' hairs covered and have like bonnets on, things like that, because
Bonnets.
because that was very much a style that was happening across the board in that day, where like lower class people had like especially women wore bonnets. So it would make sense that they would just have to wrap their hair.
Right. I mean, I think it's undeniable that there was a huge effort made to strip them of their culture.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that was a very intentional effort.
But you're saying that still to this day, though, despite those efforts, hairstyles have been one of the few things that has managed to survive.
Correct. So what we think of as traditionally Black hairstyles are coming from those hairstyles that we have passed down through the generations. So cornrows were one way that was a very easy way to maintain our hair on plantations. Like having dreads was another way that was a very easy way to maintain our hair. Twists, things like that. But those styles have since evolved, obviously, as our culture and society has evolved, and how that we've now had access to better hair products, better hair care, better knowledge about our hair. But there is still a very distinct hair culture that happens in the Black community, because Black hair is such a distinct thing to be able to deal with. So having to spend so much time getting to a style that is not only acceptable in society, but is also something that makes me feel good and something that is actually protecting my hair and not breaking it out or damaging my hair in some way, is a really fine line to balance. Because when I was chemically treating my hair and straightening it for years, it was damaging my hair constantly. The amount of time that I would spend just applying heat to my hair was so damaging long term. Not to mention the health effects of chemically straightening hair. So just being able to fit into the European beauty standards so that I could potentially get a job was not only incredibly time consuming, detrimental to my health, and also just detrimental to my hair. So
And even your mental health, though, because you're saying that you're feeling that you're not able to have the natural styles that would be your cultural tradition and would just be your natural way of doing your hair and the healthy way of doing your hair.
Correct.
You're not able to have these things. You feel oppressed in that capacity, and then you see these white ladies rocking these
and getting
hairdos just for
compliments
fun and
it
getting compliments and
left
taking advantage of
right.
it.
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting though that you pointed out that the cornrows, for example, was something that's very utilitarian. Like you put your hair in cornrows because it enables you not have to worry about your hair out in in nature, or in this case in the fields and the plantations. One example that I've seen cornrows continue to be used is for that exact same reason. Is in the UFC or in fighting sports, the people with longer hair, not always African American, Hispanic, definitely. You'll see Hispanic men doing it. Jorge Masvidal is one of the most famous ones recently. He grows his hair nice and long, and then when he goes to fight, he puts it in cornrows. But I think that you even see it beyond that. You know what I mean? Where people, just because it's a functional thing, you need to have your hair out of the way. You need to have it in some hairstyle that it's not going to get pulled. It's not going to get in your way in the middle of the fight. And so cornrows is a very functional and utilitarian thing. Now, in this case, they're not doing it with any way of saying, I'm trying to like be this style. I'm trying to, take this on as an identity thing. It's literally just, I need my hair out of the way for the fight. Do they still need to worry about the ramifications, the way that's coming across to the Black community?
It depends on how respectful they want to be to that community. So, like, if they just don't give a fuck, I mean, they're going to do it one way or the other, right? But if they want to be respectful to their Black brothers and sisters, yeah, I think that there is a necessity to say maybe not cornrows, because they could easily do like boxer braids, which are two French braids down each side. And that is just
called boxer braids?
Boxer braids.
Anything to do with boxers?
Indeed. So
really?
most female boxers tend to do their hair like that.
Well, there you go. Okay, so there are other examples where it doesn't have to be cornrows. That's interesting.
Yeah, and the thing is, there are so many braiding styles out there that aren't cultural appropriation. I'm not saying every single braid style is completely off limits to white people. There are plenty of styles that are absolutely available to white people and that look fantastic on white hair that aren't appropriation, and that actually look better on white hair than the appropriative styles.
Right.
So being lazy and just doing the style that is available, the appropriative style, instead of just putting the like extra 5 minutes in on Google to find a braid style that not only looks dope as fuck, but is still just as utilitarian.
Right.
Still comes across as
But
offensive.
in this case, let's say they're not doing it because they're pulling it from a culture. They're simply doing it because they came across it and it's functional and it's useful. And let's say that, they're doing it in a place like Finland, where the population is 99.999% white, homogenous, Finn. They don't have anybody within their culture that they could be, potentially offending, or even be aware of the fact that they're offending, because they have no relationship with that community. Isolated, it sounds like, okay, you're not offending anybody. It's when you now have these this cross pollination happening, and you're living within a society where you're sharing space, you're sharing cultural identity to a certain degree, but you also have cultural disparity that you need to respect. It's when you want to live in harmony in a single place like New York City, which is a complete melting pot. We have an opportunity all the time to experience different cultures. Like every day you can be having dinner at a different restaurant with it that's very genuinely from that culture. It's not just like, Olive Garden, which is like, ooh, we're the Italian restaurant. You know what I mean? It's like Garden. In New York, it's like you're actually having you're actually having dinner at an Italian restaurant that's run by an Italian family in many cases. So in that scenario, that's when you have to start being more aware of how your actions affect the cultures that you're interacting with.
Correct.
Because assuming that you care. Right. And it's when you don't care that it feels oppressive, it feels disrespectful, and it feels like you are just acting like somebody of privilege who is doing whatever they want and has no interest in building relationships and developing bonds between the communities.
Right. Well, that's the entitlement of being able to make that distinction.
Okay.
So having the privilege to say, I don't necessarily have to care how I come across to people is part of having white privilege.
Right.
I have to care at all times how I come across to people. both in my appearance and my mannerisms and the way that I address people.
When you say you have to care because there are ramifications for not caring.
Yes.
It affects your ability to exist successfully in that society.
Correct.
Okay.
So because I don't get the luxury of being able to stop caring for a while, seeing someone who chooses not to care is someone who is flaunting their privilege in front of me, someone who is showing that they are entitled enough that they feel like they don't need to care. And that is where it becomes offensive.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So it's not necessarily about, so this is something you often hear from people who don't necessarily take the time to understand the issue here and understand why people are getting upset. And from a distance, they just say, well, how can you tell me what to wear? How can you tell me, it's just a personal expression thing. I should have the right to wear whatever I want. And, if it offends some people, then that's their fault for getting offended. And I didn't mean it in an offensive way. So, what's the big problem? So just let me be me and it's America. It's the land of the free, but it sounds like it's not necessarily about telling people you cannot do this. You are being told that there's no legislation that's being created that says you can't, wear dreads.
Right.
The point is that if you want to exist in harmony in a society with multiple different cultures, you need to make the effort to understand why certain things come across in certain ways.
Correct.
And it's an appeal to people under the assumption that they care.
Right.
Rather than telling them you have to do this because I am now oppressing you with reverse racism.
Oh.
Which is a conversation for another day.
We are absolutely not getting into that one today. So yeah, basically it's a showing of mutual respect. So I'm not going to do something that I know for a fact is offensive to you just because I have no reason to be overtly offensive to you. And I would hope that you would have that same respect for me, that you would at least try to be sensitive to the fact that there are certain things that you can do that will be offensive. And if someone calls you out and says, hey, what you're doing is offensive to me, what you're doing harms me, what you're doing hurts me, and you say, shrugs, get over it, it diminishes my ability to trust you. It diminishes my ability to want to be around you.
Yeah.
And it diminishes my respect for you overall. So you can absolutely wear cultural appropriation, like go right the fuck ahead, but there will be consequences to it. And there will be negative societal consequences to it where you may lose out on close friendships. You may lose out on people who respect you. You may not be able to garner the same respect as the rest of your peers in the same situations because you chose to engage in this thing that was pointed out to you as offensive.
And you may be perpetuating barriers between the cultures that we're trying to break down.
Correct.
When you're showing that lack of respect, you're almost putting up barriers and saying, I don't care that there are barriers. I don't care that I'm contributing to those barriers. And I just want to continue being able to do what I want. And people take offense at that, then it doesn't matter to me. And that basically says that you don't care about bringing people together.
Right.
Now, I think we need to talk about some of these interesting examples.
Okay.
Like Eminem, for example. He's somebody who grew up in Detroit in the hip hop community and fully embraced it. It was his entire identity. All of his friends were part of that community. He gained respect within that community. He wasn't Vanilla Ice. He wasn't some white kid from the suburbs who's like, I'm going to be a rapper and I'm going to, take on this culture
make it big.
and make it my own. Or he wasn't even Elvis, who took on, black music of the time and totally made it his own with no
regard.
Well, just no. There was no give it. He didn't bring them along with him. It wasn't. It was literally just picking and choosing what he wanted from it and then running with it as if it were his own.
Correct.
Eminem was never like, I came up with all this stuff on my own. He was so immersed in the culture that, all of his producers, all of his co-artists, all the people he collaborated with, all the people that he brought on stage with him at every point of his career or that brought him on stage with them. Dre brought him up because Dre saw him as being an awesome part of the hip hop community.
Correct.
Can you do, because it's still cultural appropriation. It's still a white guy doing black music, is it not?
Yes. So Eminem is an unusual case because it is still cultural appropriation. He is still doing black music and profiting off of it. So he is profiting off of black culture. However, I mean, if you've ever listened to any of Eminem's like old music, he is the first person to point out he is doing black music. He knows that this is black music. He acknowledges that this is black music. He acknowledges that he is engaging in a level of cultural appropriation. The difference is that he did it with respect the entire time that he like was at his peak. Even now, he's still around, but like you don't see him as much. He's still being
That
respectful.
motherfucker's still putting out an album like every year.
I fucking know.
Every year.
It's
I can't keep
crazy
up.
to me. Like, he has calmed the fuck down. He has gotten to the point where Haley is like 30. Like,
Is she our age, really?
okay, when we were like 13, she was like,
Probably like 5.
Five?
Yeah, so she's like,
So-
wow, she's like 8 years younger than us. That is crazy.
yeah, so she's in her 20s.
Wow.
It's weird.
Wow.
It's real weird. I feel real old.
So in the case of Eminem, there's a clear communication happening where he
Right.
is involved in the community. He's communicating with the community. He's understanding the community. He's getting feedback from the community. He's
Yes.
being molded by that community.
Correct.
He is not an outsider picking and choosing and keeping his distance.
Correct. And he's also giving a platform to other black artists.
Mm-hmm.
So there were plenty of times where he brought black artists that may have been lesser known, that may have been more obscure, and he made sure to give them a platform,
Yeah.
whether it was having them collab on a song, whether it was having them come on stage with him, whether like whatever that was, he made sure to always give credit to black artists, to work with almost exclusively black artists, and to make sure that when he was working with black artists, he was doing so respectfully. And he was also unusual in the sense that as angry and ridiculous as his music was, as sexist and homophobic as it used to be, he made it a point to never use the N-word. And in his entire career, he only used it twice. And both times he used it in a live show with the explicit permission of the person that he was using it towards as a sign of friendship and respect. And it wasn't during a song. It was while he was having like a one-on-one, like on-stage conversation
Right.
with one of his friends.
Right. It wasn't like Shawn Mendes.
Right.
Did you catch that whole thing?
Oh,
He's blowing up on Twitter actually today. He's I can't remember. There's some hashtag going around, but basically it's the tweets. Some tweets surfaced from when he was like 14, where he was using the N-word in a positive way, like my
Right.
brother. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Joking around about it, like saying these things that were just he's some white kid from the suburbs and
Yeah.
like trying
He
to
could not.
appropriate that culture essentially,
Right.
act like he's a part of it, whereas he has no connection to the community.
Right.
So it's just disrespectful.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing. Eminem recognized that because like he was immersed in the community from the beginning. So there is something to be said about cultural immersion, where it isn't as much borrowing as it is respectfully displaying the community that you are from, that you're used to being around, while also, so as much as his music was appropriation, it was also a platform for other black voices. So he was being as respectful as he could while towing the line of appropriation. So he is one of the best case scenarios in that situation where his entire career, he was actively trying to uplift black voices. He was actively trying to give black people a platform and make sure they were getting paid and make sure that other people were being pulled along with him. And he wasn't just taking the money and running
Nice.
and profiting off of this and refusing to look back at the black community who built him, but instead constantly being grateful. Anytime you saw him getting an award, he was surrounded by black artists who were there ostensibly getting that award with him.
Yeah.
He saw them as his family, that like where he goes, they went. And that in and of itself is part of the respect of the culture, where he found a way to do a thing that is typically seen as cultural appropriation in a respectful way without completely negating his ability to be part of that culture.
So back to my question about if as an artist you are inspired by a culture and you want to incorporate aspects of that culture into your art, Eminem would be an example of how to do it well.
Right. Because he
lived it.
Right. And at every step, he was constantly asking other Black artists, is this too much? Is this enough? Is this okay? Can I say this? Should I not say this? And like, I mean, he's not perfect. I don't want to go on record saying he's the shining light.
Right, but as an example of like what you should try to do.
Right. Like, I don't think that he failed in his ability to be respectful to the Black culture. I think that he was actually respectful in his use of rap music. But I mean, again, like I said, he's not perfect. There were missed opportunities. There were places where he had missteps, what have you. But I think that overall, he was a better example of acculturation than appropriation.
Interesting. So we differentiate between the two.
Yes.
Acculturation being, you know, inspiration from a culture where you're doing it in a respectful way and making the effort to understand that you're actually doing it in a respectful way, because it's also possible to think you're doing it in a respectful way, but not doing it in a respectful way because you're not making the effort to understand, you're not making the effort to communicate. We talked about the power dynamics. We talked about how the power dynamics on an equal footing between, let's say, the Asian community and the African-American community. What about reverse, when you have somebody from a marginalized community appropriating aspects of a culture that is traditionally having a power dynamic over them? Can that be a cultural appropriation, or does it just not matter in that scenario because of the power dynamic? It's like, get over it in that case.
That's a beautiful question.
It's funny. I actually, for the longest time, I was struggling to think of an example of this, and for some reason, an example just pops in my head. So we've been having this conversation for a couple of days now, and this is something that I've been, trying to think of. Like, can I think of an example where this happened? Because not really. The thing that popped in my head was Snoop Dogg at Electric Zoo.
Oh,
where he's doing his DJ set.
That was such a beautiful.
Electric Zoo is an EDM festival that's basically just a bunch of really drunk and high teenage to college age kids doing drugs and dancing and having a great time and expressing themselves, and it's wonderful and
ridiculous. Oh my god!
But for some reason Snoop Dogg got booked as Snoop Lion to DJ it.
That was when
he gets up on stage and
be a reggae.
He's playing all kinds of interesting stuff, and then at some point he realizes it's basically just a bunch of white kids out there, and he's like, what the fuck do white people like to listen to anyway? And he puts on 99 Luftballons. You know what I mean? He's just like, basically, what do I do? I don't really know how to, this isn't my crowd. Like a DJ usually get up on stage and you're DJing to your crowd, what they're looking to hear. And he basically felt out of place, and he goes, what the fuck do white people like to listen to anyway? And plays this absurd, this is what I think white people music song is. Like, is that an example of him being disrespectful, and does it matter? Because obviously I don't really feel offended by it at the end of the day, but I'm just wondering, that's an example of somebody just being like, this is ridiculous and absurd. I'm not going to make the effort to understand. I'm not going to make the effort to try to make a set that appeals to this audience. I'm just going to do my thing. But then also the reference to 99 Luftballons, really, Snoop? That's what you think white people music is?
Honestly,
it's kind of fun. I mean, it's comical. But so here we are laughing about it.
Yeah.
Because the power dynamic is reversed.
Yes.
There's no oppression happening. Correct. Nobody's getting offended by Snoop Dogg in a way where they feel like, But
also, I think it was just a beautiful example of him just trolling.
Well, yes, for sure. So let's talk about that, though. Can you just be a troll in a way that's harmless, and it's like, you know what, get over it? Like, somebody's just kind of making light of the whole situation?
So, in answer to your question, when the power dynamics are reversed and you have a marginalized community that is taking aspects of the culture of the oppressive community. So in this case, Black people taking things from white culture and making it part of their identity. That is actually not appropriation. That is assimilation. And a lot of times...
Oh, that's so interesting.
Assimilation is actually a defense mechanism, and it is for safety purposes.
That's so true. Like, for example, having to do your hair in a certain way in order to get job opportunities and to fit in with the culture.
Having to adhere to European beauty standards to get a job. That is assimilation, not appropriation.
That's so interesting. And that's so obvious now that you point it out. Huh.
Yeah, it's one of those weird things. And this is why power dynamics are so important, and why understanding power dynamics is so central to understanding cultural appropriation and quite a few other issues around marginalized identity, like sexism, homophobia, transphobia, all kinds of stuff. It has to do with power dynamics. So once you understand power dynamics and their role in the overall story,
Right.
you understand why, one, reverse racism isn't a thing. We're going to get to that a whole different day. We're not
In
even
another
going to.
episode.
We're literally not. We're going to put a pin in that and come back.
We got to keep this one under 2 hours because we're already on an hour. We're having a great time here.
But it's also why, as a marginalized person, me doing things from the quote oppressor's culture isn't appropriation, because a lot of times I'm going to be forced to do this thing, otherwise I'm going to suffer consequences.
Right, absolutely.
Sometimes at the risk of my own safety.
Right.
So in order to, in any way, not only survive but attempt to thrive, you have the necessity of assimilation.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting that you brought up the kind of opportunity or the times where marginalized groups kind of appropriate from each other. I think we were talking earlier about African American vernacular and how
African American vernacular English.
vernacular English.
AAVE.
Got it. And how it gets appropriated and where that often happens is interesting.
Oh, this one.
Is this something we want to get into today?
I mean, I will totally get into it today. It's just something that like is kind of the teensiest bit of a sore spot for me. So the place that it is most frequently appropriated is by white cis gay men. And in case some people don't know what cis means, that just means that you are someone who identifies with the gender that you were born with. So gay men, cis gay men, white cis gay men are very close to a lot of black gay men. And black gay men obviously use AAVE quite frequently. I mean, the black community in general uses it pretty frequently. It is, linguists have actually studied it and found that it is its own language. It is similar to English and can be understood by English speakers, but it is in fact its own language and has its own grammatical rules, and those rules actually hold up and make sense. But that's, again, conversation for another day. But it gets appropriated very quickly through gay culture, and what ends up happening is because white gay males use it, then you have the drag queens who turn around and use it, and then the drag queens use it in their shows, and the people who are coming to their shows are like, oh my God, that's so cute. I'm totally going to use that phrase.
Give
Absolutely.
me some examples.
So saying like something's on fleek, that came from black culture. Saying yes, queen, black culture. Those are both AAVE. Saying get it, sis, again, AAVE. There are plenty of things like finna, like I'm finna do something. That's AAVE. But it gets appropriated in the sense that you like white people hear their white gay friends use it and think, oh my God, that's just so cute. I'm just like taking it from the gay boys. So like, it's totally fine. It's not. You're literally just like.
That's so interesting because this is actually one of the few things where I realize that's something that I've done.
It's something that most people have done and not even realized it.
Well, that's what's so interesting about it, because most of the other examples I can kind of look on and I can, whereas necessarily before we've had this in-depth conversation about what makes certain things cultural appropriation or what makes them offensive, I'd always kind of looked on them as just like, other people exploring their creative expression, and it was never something that I identified with anyway. You know what I mean? Right. I wasn't going to go and do my hair in certain styles. I don't know. I'm just not that creative with my styling. But what's interesting
the black
is
T-shirt totally gave that away.
having been involved in the gay community here in New York,
Mm-hmm.
it is hard not to, especially when you're in the club or at a drag show or you're just hanging out at a party. I tend to be a bit of a chameleon and pick up on some of the linguistic things happening around me.
And it's fun.
Or
to
if I'm in
use.
Ireland, I start having, acting like I have a little bit of an Irish accent, like that kind of, and they're fun to use, like, yes, sis. Like, I've definitely said that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's challenging to not fall into that.
Yeah. It's one of those weird situations where you're, especially because language is so fluid and because it's always evolving and it's always changing, it's really hard to keep track of like, where does every single thing come from, right? So you can't always say like every single word that I'm using, I know for a fact didn't come from Black culture. That's really difficult to constantly police yourself, but it is worth taking a moment and saying, okay, this is something that's being brought up to me. Maybe I should look into what AAVE actually is and see, like, because you can start to see things that are very similar sounding. So when you realize what AAVE actually is, you realize that there are a lot of patterns in that language.
Mm-hmm.
And once you see those patterns, you can start to see where the new words that we're seeing in mainstream society are coming from and where those
yeah, I mean, language is so challenging because it morphs and it crosses barriers. Just like you're texting somebody and you'd be like, sure, homie. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, does that come from AAVE? Like, I wouldn't even know. You know what I mean?
So I think that comes more just from Black culture, not necessarily from AAVE.
Right, but does that, am I being disrespectful in using that word in that way in a private text conversation that had no intention of referencing anything? It was just,
right.
For some reason it's ended up in my brain as a way of responding to somebody, even though I wouldn't necessarily like do it out in public, be like, what's up, my homie? You know what I mean? Like, I'm not going to act in a certain way, but for some reason in a text I've actually used it. I'm thinking, on that. It's, and it's fascinating how things like this creep in to your language and creep into just your thoughts even, in ways that you just have no ability to be constantly policing it unless you have had these kinds of conversations with people, and you be made aware of that.
And that also brings up a very excellent point. No one is expecting perfection.
Right.
When you are trying to be a better ally, no one is expecting perfection. I'm never going to expect that anyone in my life, no matter what color they are going to be perfect. I used to say and do a whole lot of colorist and low-key racist stuff to other Black people, not realizing that I had a lot of internalized racism that I had to unlearn.
That's interesting. So even being a part of, that's funny because I say even being a part of that community, because somebody could share the color of their skin, but not necessarily have the same cultural background
not
as
all
people.
Skin folk are kinfolk.
And be assumed to be a part of that community, but then not, actually have the understanding. Could be in the same boat where they can be culturally appropriating stuff without even realizing it, thinking, oh, I have that same skin color, so I can just do whatever I want with it. I have a free pass to it.
Correct.
So I think what it comes down to at the end of the day is understanding, respect, and being open to continue to maintaining an open dialogue. So for example, we've talked about different levels of offensiveness in cultural appropriation.
Right.
As you get down to the language one, that's just like morphing and moving around, and it's difficult to constantly be vigilant in policing yourself. I think the point is that as long as your intentions are good and you maintain open dialogue and you're open to feedback, and you're communicating with people from those cultures, that's really what we should strive for. It's not necessarily perfection.
Right.
It's strive for making the effort
and to
caring.
be better on a daily basis.
Yeah.
You're always going to fuck up. You're always going to have moments where you get called out, you slip up. But as long as you are willing to be humble and listen and be thankful that someone is taking the time to educate you and help you be better, and understand that no matter what their tone, the fact that they are taking the time out of their day, they are putting the emotional effort and labor in to educating you and saying, hey, by the way, you were wrong here.
So it's interesting using the word educate, because when you say educating somebody, it comes across almost as
Condescending?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In a way that I could see people kind of recoil from that,
Sure.
rather than saying, hey, I'm having a conversation with you and explaining to you why what the actions, the specific actions that you're taking are coming across as negative towards me.
Right.
So, and that's more of an open exchange of human connection, as
Sure.
opposed to like, hey, you're not living your life in the right way, and I'm going to tell you the right way that you have to live it. Because I totally see people talk about these conversations in that way, basically saying people are just policing us and telling us you can't be this, you can't be that, and I'm just living my life. I'm not trying to offend anybody. I am the way I am, and I think that that's a very common refrain. It's a very common reaction that people have, and they don't want to be educated.
Right.
And when we talk about it as education, I'm worried that potentially it breaks down the barrier, or it doesn't break down the barrier. It creates a barrier rather than breaking down the barriers.
So the reason that I chose education specifically is because at the beginning of the conversation, you asked, how would I differentiate someone who is overt versus inadvertent racist? And if you are doing something that I assume is inadvertently racist, that you didn't realize it was racist, that you weren't actively trying to be racist while doing it, I am going to assume that there is a gap in your knowledge somewhere, that you missed this like memo. You didn't catch this one particular thing to know, hey, by the way, what you're doing right now, it's not the move.
But saying that you didn't catch the memo is like saying that there was a memo that was put out that you should have caught.
Right.
When somebody could just simply have not had the right life experience or the right exposure.
But that lacking of the right life experience that's what I'm saying is a gap in your knowledge.
Right.
And so I'm trying to close that gap in your knowledge. And the best way to do that is to educate you about what that gap is.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of another example of this. So when you...
like, I understand where you're coming from and that like, it sounds like it's a harsh word, but I mean it in a very loving and respectful way. Like,
I get that.
I'm not going to sit here and like preach at you and...
Totally get that. And that's why we're able to have this conversation, because we have that understanding between each other. I'm worried about the situations where people don't have that understanding, and I'm just wondering if there's ways that we can communicate it so that they are more able to be receptive towards it.
Right. So the best way to do that is the people who are closest to that person are the people who are going to have to call that person in.
Yeah.
So you and I are friends, so I can very easily and confidently say, hey, by the way, what you just said was kind of out of line. And you might not have realized it. So like, let me just let you know, like, this is the background as to why this is kind of offensive, why this is out of line.
Right.
And
that to me doesn't sound like you're educating me. That to me sounds like you're just simply explaining to me. I mean, it is education. I don't know why the word somehow.
I'm teaching you something that you didn't know. Is that not education?
Well, so if there was something about me that somebody didn't know, and we're not talking culturally, we're not talking, but just something about me, like let's say that something, certain things bothered me, right? And you just had no idea about that if you were to say certain words in front of me, that they could affect me in a really awful way. And that can happen. It has nothing to do with culture. It could have to do with some sort of trauma that you just had no idea that I had. I wouldn't say that I'm educating you on the fact that those things are bothering me. I would say that I'm explaining it to you so that you know where I'm coming from.
Right.
You know what I mean?
But I mean,
it's less patronizing.
Yeah.
Because when I say educating, it's almost as if you should have known.
Right. And
you may feel that people should have known when it comes to cultural appropriation, but the problem is people don't.
No, I get that.
And we need to have conversations with them in a way that doesn't just turn them off.
Correct. And I totally get that. So I understand where you're coming from in that, like, yes, I understand that educating sounds like a kind of harsh word. And there are varying degrees. Like, there are varying degrees to which someone may call you out or in. So I might, as your friend, say, like, pull you off to the side and be like, hey, so that outfit that you're wearing right now, like, oof, you should probably never wear that one again. Like, this one, it's not the move. It's offensive, right? And I'm not going to say that necessarily as like a patronizing thing. As your friend, I want to help you be better and do better. So I would assume that my friends would want to help me be better and do better as well. And the best way that we can do that is to educate each other and to uplift each other and help fill in these gaps in each other's knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, that makes total sense.
Yeah. So along the lines of different things that are common cultural appropriation, the same way that you may not have realized that AAVE was appropriation in your speech. One of the most common forms of appropriation that's happening on almost a daily basis is actually the appropriation in emojis. And this is where things get really
That's so interesting.
weird.
Because they've really made an effort over the past few years. Obviously, when the emojis first came out, they were very kind of basic and boring, and
Yes.
also kind of white-centric, even though they
bit.
were just
Well, bad.
these like Simpson yellow skin tones.
Mhm.
I think that was their attempt to like make it non-racial.
Yep.
But they were very limited in terms of their scope, and I think that also comes from the Silicon Valley's always had this issue of just basically not having enough cultural representation
Right.
in Silicon Valley. So they're just the programmers, the designers, they're very limited in their ability to think these things through. So the first iterations of things often struggle from that. But since then, they've made an effort to diversify culturally. But would you say that some of this is done in a tone deaf way?
So it's not necessarily that I think that the emojis themselves are tone deaf. It's how people are using the emojis that's tone deaf.
So it's not necessarily on like Apple or whoever is putting out the emojis.
I mean, they could be better, but that's not.
They are making an effort, though.
They are making an effort. Efforts are made. But it's the.
Which on the scale of not making an effort to making an effort is something.
It's something. It's better than nothing.
Or on the scale of not caring to
We
caring.
appreciate
Yeah.
effort.
Yeah.
Effort is great.
Yeah.
It's the way that the emojis are being used. And one of the most common misuses of emojis is using emojis from a skin tone that is darker than your own. And a lot of times...
What would be an example of that? It's not something I'm familiar with.
So a perfect example of that is one of the most common emojis to be used very recently is the fist emoji, right? So it is showing solidarity with Black Lives Matter and the Black Power movement, right? So you have the common fist. As a white person, you should be using your white fist. But a lot of white people are in fact using a darker shade fist than their actual skin tone.
Because they
And
think that that's
by significantly
showing their respect for the
darker.
movement.
Yeah.
Because it actually is traditionally in the Black Power movement. Even it's not just a black skin hand. It is a black glove,
Right.
black leather glove, like the darkest. It's not even a skin tone. It's
Right.
like
It's a black leather glove.
right.
Right.
It's dyed black. So somebody could think that they're using the darkest skin tone emoji, showing solidarity with that. But that's coming across as cultural appropriation.
Yeah. So it's not just like that's just a common example, but also you have like using like the clapping hands, using darker skin tones for clapping hands, or using darker skin tones for the praying hands as a means of like trying to add emphasis. And it's not adding emphasis, it is virtual blackface. If that is not your skin tone, don't use it. Like,
I mean, it's so interesting because thinking about other ways that this happens where people use different skin tones.
Yeah.
In quite a few cultures, there is a discrimination towards people within that culture who have darker skin tones than lighter skin tones. And I don't just mean different races. I mean within the same races.
colorism is a thing.
And this is big, I think, in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And so it is common for people to use a lighter, I think I'm probably hypothesizing here, but I think I've heard that it is common for people to use a lighter skin tone emoji, maybe than, or how they want to think of themselves as being lighter.
Right.
Right. So that would be a case where it's people are doing it in a way that's not even healthy for themselves.
Right.
And you would think that going back in the other direction could potentially be kind of re-embracing a positivity towards darker skin tones, but it's not.
Right. It's like I said, it's virtual blackface. And it's using the skin tone of someone that you're not to give off either a vibe where, oh, I'm cooler, or I'm more liberal, or I'm an ally, or you're trying to boost yourself in some way by using a darker skin tone than you actually have. And like there's already plenty of issues with the fact that like the default tone in emojis is yellow, which is rather white centric if you're looking at The Simpsons. but that's like,
Well, actually, this article that you showed me that goes into depth on this is really
which
interesting.
obviously we're gonna
because
link.
it's not immediately obvious to somebody who hasn't thought about this why that Simpsons skin tone is white centric. Because I think what the technology companies were trying to do is by using this non-realistic skin tone, make it non-racial.
Right.
So it just applies to everybody. It's not saying this is, but the problem is we have this historical context of this being used in a show called The Simpsons, where on that show, only the white characters had that skin tone. And it turns out that they actually used darker skin tones for people that they were representing as being from
Oh yeah, all of the actual
other races.
BIPC, like the BIPOC, are.
Can you explain that BIPOC? It's an acronym.
Yeah. See,
what is the BI?
Sorry. Wow. BIPOC. So, Black Indigenous People of Color.
Black and Indigenous people of color, or that they're one person. They're a person who is black.
Black and or.
Meaning all people that fit under either of those categories. Got it. Okay.
So Black, Indigenous, people of color also includes Asian people because they are people of color as well. And when we say Black, we don't necessarily just mean African American. That also includes Indian. That also includes
Caribbean, which is also of African descent, but
correct. So it's basically any brown person, because that is also a Latinx thing as well. Like they are POC. They are absolutely melanated. They've got that color in them. So we just want to make sure, again, we pay homage to the fact that Indigenous people are in the equation, that they are in the picture. So that's why you have the BIPOC. And that goes back to the why we call them Indigenous and not Native. Or when did we start doing that? So I don't know exactly when that transferred over, but it is common enough that like you see the acronym for it, not necessarily realizing that that's what the I stands for.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So, I mean, but speaking of The Simpsons, though, it is interesting because people don't think of that skin tone as being white-centric, but because The Simpsons specifically used it as a white-centric skin tone, and the people of color on the show had a different skin tone, therefore that yellow skin tone is associated.
They were distinctly brown.
So whoever had that idea to use that skin tone as being assuming that was their intention, and I could just be giving them too much credit here for assuming that was their intention, but assuming that was, then that was a mistake. It was unfortunate. So then they decided to branch out into incorporating the full range of skin tones. I think they done a good job there.
They got closer. I mean,
obviously there's more than 6 skin tones or whatever number they have. But
I mean, it's close enough that like when you're dealing with emoji, like, okay, it's like a foundation match. You're not necessarily going to get your perfect foundation match. You're not necessarily going to get.
I've never had that problem.
I know, you just have the most perfect skin. It's so easy to match.
So okay, so they're making an effort, but it's the way that people have now started using these different emojis where it has become problematic.
Yes. So that's where it gets into the digital blackface, and this actually happens in GIFs as well, where
I like that you say GIF.
Yeah. Well.
High five.
I mean.
Team GIF.
Forever. It's GIF. Get over it.
Exactly.
You wouldn't say like, I'm not even, you know what?
Let's not go into that.
No. That's a whole other argument. So when you're using GIFs, a lot of people, especially white people, will use GIFs of Black people to express a particular sentiment. But there are a wide range of GIFs that are available of white people expressing that exact same sentiment.
See, this is challenging, though, because that I could almost see as you're using somebody expressing the sentiment as if they are your friend. And let's say you do have friends and you're in a community of people where, you've got mixtures of all kinds of cultures. And, let's say you use Mindy Kaling expressing something. You know what I mean? Like, is that do you have to specifically only find, if I'm white, I can only use a white person because these GIF expressions, I mean, it's a fascinating way of expressing that has just like exploded over the past decade.
Sure.
And being adopted by especially the younger generation who has no concept of any of these larger issues that we're talking about.
I mean, give the younger generation credit. They're a lot more woke than you think they are.
They're also a lot not.
Look,
and they also, a lot of, like, they haven't quite reached the level.
They're still young.
Okay, fine. Let's
They're
not
still
get
young,
into that either. Let's not get into that either.
All right.
Where I was going with this, though, is it almost feels like you're breaking down barriers when somebody can identify as any one of these individual or separate actors or musicians or whatever it is that are expressing something in a certain way, and you pull that GIF
Right.
to use it.
So that's the thing. Like sometimes,
like the Parks and Rec GIF for the what's his name? You know what I'm talking about?
I mean, there's a lot from
There's
Andy.
a lot from Parks and Rec. You know, but for example, there's so many of those, and it's like if you're not from that race, you can't use that as an expression of the expression that you're feeling.
So that's not necessarily the case. It's when you are relying on only using black faces to express your emotional range.
But how do you decide that somebody's only doing it
I mean,
versus it's a one-off?
okay, so like a one-off situation, like sometimes there are situations where like when you're looking for a specific GIF, it is kind of hard to find one.
Like Beyonce has so many good GIFs. I can't use any of those GIFs to be like, I'm feeling that right now, because she expresses something that not a lot of other people express in the way that she does. And I get that that's part of the appropriation within the gay community that we talked about earlier. But this is so interesting because it gets back to the language thing, where again, we're not in the level where it's like, you know, the same level of cultural appropriation as the hair.
Right.
Right. We're now at a more minor level where we can have some debate about it, I think. I'm struggling with this. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
You know, because like there's probably going to be a time where I'm like, yeah, I'm really identifying with the way that Beyonce is moving in this GIF right now. And I want to send that to somebody and being like, this is what I'm feeling right now. But that's inappropriate.
Sure. So again,
it feels respectful to me.
So it depends, right? So like,
because I'm respecting Beyonce as her full identity. I'm not whitewashing her.
Right. The thing is, there's so many times where people are using black people in GIFs as a means of seeming cooler or as a means of gaining more social clout, or like, because
I mean, I can see how that can be true, but I don't see how it's necessarily true.
Right. So black culture is very fascinating, and it is very magnetic. So it's something that a lot of people want to be a part of. It's something that a lot of people want to engage with. It's something that a lot of people want to identify with.
And why is that a bad thing?
I mean, it's not a bad thing, but there's a lot of ways that people are trying to engage with black culture that are not respectful. And
I get that. I'm trying to see how this specifically is that.
So the digital black,
and I can definitely see how it can be that. Like, I can see how people can totally use these things in a way you're like, come on, like you're being disrespectful. You're not actually engaging with the community. You're maybe using it in an ironic way where it's like it's not showing respect. But I think I can see ways where people can do it in a way that it's not disrespectful.
Yeah. So like one of my friends, white woman, wonderful human, like has always been an ally, has always tried to be an ally, has always tried to better herself. The one place where she continues to slip up is every time she sends an emoji, she's using black hands emojis.
Okay, the emoji thing I get.
Like she is forever using.
I get that. I
like,
totally get
black
that.
hands
I
emojis.
totally get that.
So it's kind of the same thing where if you're consistently always relying on black people to show your emotions through GIFs, that becomes digital blackface.
Okay. So I see how this is something it's more a question of pattern.
Right.
Not necessarily like always, if you do this one thing, you are instantly being inappropriate.
Again,
it's a question of pattern. It's a question of relying on, you know, another culture to show your solidarity with the culture in a way that's like, it's just a little bit insensitive.
Right.
Okay.
And again, everyone's going to fuck up. Everyone's going to make mistakes. Sometimes you're going to forget. You're going to send that Beyonce GIF.
Or another one that keeps popping into my head is the dude from The Wire. What was his name? The Omar. Was it Omar?
The dude. Watched The Wire,
oh my God. He was just such an iconic character, and he just had so many good lines that there's just so many good GIFs of him that fit into so many good scenarios where you're just like, I need that GIF of Omar right now. I might have the wrong name. I think it was Omar. He was the one. He was the outcast. He robbed the drug dealers. He lived on the edges of society.
I believe
he was
you.
gay.
I just never saw The Wire.
Such
so
fascinating character, and he was just such a badass. He just didn't give a fuck about anyone, and everybody can identify with that. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And it wasn't because he was black.
Right.
Like he almost transcended, skin color. Like it wasn't about his skin color. He wasn't doing this just as a black man. He was just a badass person.
Right.
Who the actor happened to be a black person who
Correct.
portrayed it. Yeah, I mean, so this is interesting. I think we're getting into an area where there is still some amount of gray.
Sure. And obviously, we're going to post links to all of the sources of information that have informed this conversation on both sides. Because I do have a perfect article about digital blackface through GIFs for you.
Okay, yeah, I need to read that. But this is what's so interesting about this whole conversation. I think we've spanned quite a decent area here where there are things that are kind of very distinctively cultural appropriation in a way that's kind of obviously offensive, even if a lot of people don't see it as obviously offensive. But when you have the conversation with them, it's easy to explain it to them. At least that was my experience in the way that we've had this conversation. Eventually, you kind of get down into the nitty gritty of things that are happening right now, that are evolving right now.
Right.
And it's this bubbling of culture where you want cultures to be able to blend to a certain degree. You want cultures to be able to be inspired by each other. You want people to be able to identify with different cultures so that we can feel more like we're all part of the same human race.
Right.
We want that to happen.
Right.
But there are still parts where you have to be cognizant of the power dynamics. You have to be cognizant of the way it's coming across to other people.
Correct.
And so the point, I think, with this conversation, the takeaway for me with this conversation is that you need to be continuing to maintain open dialogue and being willing to have conversations with people and being open to hearing from people that, hey, maybe that thing that you did was not respectful. And rather than recoiling and being like, I'm not racist, I can do that.
Right.
You'd be like, okay, I'm going to understand you. I'm going to try to learn from you. And I'm going to try to adjust my behavior in such a way that I can, hopefully not offend you again in a similar way. And at the end of the day, we need to be better humans. And that's what this is about. It's about being more understanding and just having better communication.
Yeah.
Better understanding.
And just learning how to be more respectful in your day-to-day life when dealing with your fellow humans.
Yeah.
So it's not even necessarily that, again, no one's expecting perfection. No one's expecting you to always know every single thing about cultural appropriation and every single thing about race.
Yeah.
But when someone says to you, hey, what you were doing was actually kind of offensive, sit with that for a moment before you get defensive. Understand where they might be coming from. Understand how difficult it may have been for them to even say it to you in the first place, knowing that it may be a very triggering topic. It may be a very sensitive topic. It may be difficult for them to actually approach you because maybe they don't know you as well. But it's an opportunity that they see to say, hey, by the way, I see you might want to actually do better, and let me just help you out here, friend. Here's how you do better. No matter how much it hurts to hear in that moment, always take it from a place of love. Because again, no matter how it's being said to you, even if it's being said in a way that you feel is kind of condescending, even if you feel that the person is being kind of aggressive, it's coming to you from a place of love and coming to you from a place of respect, because they obviously have enough respect for you to think that you not only have the ability to do better, but you have the desire to do better.
Right. And the important thing to remember is that it's when somebody is speaking, opening up to you about how something that you've done has affected them, even if it feels difficult in the moment to hear that, it's important to remember that the alternative there is that they simply didn't say anything and that you simply missed an opportunity to connect with somebody. And it's only when we actually have these difficult conversations and open up about them and share with each other how our actions affect each other that we can build better relationships and break down barriers. So even if it's challenging in the moment, at least take to heart that somebody reaching out to you in that capacity is doing it with the intention of enabling you to have a better understanding of their perspective. Because if we all just walk away from these scenarios and just end up, being like, oh, that motherfucker, and not engaging, then that's how we end up with these cultural divides where where it becomes much more difficult to have these conversations. So
Absolutely.
yeah, I think that's the takeaway here. This has been a really awesome conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know that it's not always easy to jump into these conversations, especially with people that maybe just haven't taken enough time to learn enough about it on their own.
Absolutely.
And but at the end of the day, I think that the more we can do this kind of thing, the better our world and our country and our society will be. So I really look forward to having a lot more of these kind of conversations, especially as we get into the really like nuanced gray areas of how things are bubbling and changing right now. That is so exciting to me because there can be conversation about that where maybe not everybody agrees. And honestly, we'd love to hear what you guys think about all the things that we talked about here today. What has your experience been with cultural appropriation? How have you approached these issues with people around you? And what advice do you have for other people who are thinking about these issues? We'd love to hear from you. Leave us a comment down below. Send us a message. Send us a message on Twitter, Facebook. We're on all the social media platforms. Reddit. We have a Reddit fun time program on Reddit /r/fun time program. Anywhere that you want to have a conversation with us, we will engage with you. We are all about having fun and having conversations in a way that brings people together. So
we really want to have a dialogue.
Exactly. We really want to hear from you guys. We really want to start thinking about the next things that we're going to be talking about. We're hoping to do a few of these every week. We're planning to jump right back into it tomorrow. We're going to be right back here in the studio.
Yes, we are.
We have a whole list of topics that we're going to be jumping into.
Yes. And they're going to be sometimes a lot more fun and a lot more frivolous. And
a little bit more lighthearted. Not always quite so heavy. And not always 2 hours long. Are we?
No.
Yeah, we're getting up there in time. But yeah, we'd really appreciate if you guys could take the time to, drop us a like or subscribe to the channel on YouTube or on whatever podcasting platform where you like to catch this kind of content. It really helps for us to get exposure to a wider audience so that we can have, more interesting conversations with more people and even bring on interesting guests who can help to educate us on these topics because, at the end of the day, the only way you can really learn about these kinds of things is talking to people. So,
yep, absolutely. Well, we look forward to hearing from you soon and seeing you again even sooner. Have a wonderful and safe rest of your day. And remember to wear your fucking masks.
And remember to have some fun. See you guys next time.